Hello. Hi, everybody. On behalf of Science Based Targets Network, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar covering the first science-based targets, which are now available, and covering what action companies can take now. Before we get started, we're just going to give a moment for the broader attendees to join, and then we'll get moving. Hello, if you're just joining, we'll be starting in just a moment.
Hi, Erin. Nigel here.
Hi, Nigel. Great to see folks rolling into the room. We'll be starting in one more minute. Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We've got a stacked agenda, so we're going to go ahead and get started. First, just a couple of housekeeping items. Please note for Q&A that you may enter your questions as we go. Our team is on the line and we'll answer what we can in the chat and via live Q&A that we'll have toward the end of this session. Then for questions we're not able to get to because we are anticipating a large group today, we will aggregate the questions we receive to review and update our FAQs as a follow-up. Also, this session is recorded for those that were unable to join today. Today's webinar focuses on the first corporate science-based targets for nature. This is a big day for us at SBTN. We're going to start off with having some opening remarks from Nigel Topping, the Global Ambassador for UNFCCC's High-Level Champions. And then I will cover an overview of the first release. And then we have some of our key technical leaders on the line, Barsha, Alan, and Craig, who will cover content on, cover an overview of the content we're releasing today. I will close with how companies are taking action, and then we will have some time for Q&A. So first, Nigel, thanks for joining us today. Can you set the stage for today's session for us?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me say congratulations, Erin, to you and the team and all the partners and all the businesses who've been involved in getting us here. You know, we have now got some real momentum, and I'll illustrate that across policymakers and business on the solutions to emissions reductions from energy and industrial uses. But all of that will be for nothing if we don't drive the same kind of exponential transformation in delivering the solutions to the nature crisis. And this, as everyone here knows, this is hard work. You know, we actually launched the Science-Based Targets Initiative for climate a year ahead of Paris. Of course, Paris gave us a clear North Star. Since then, we've been able to turn that into pathways for every sector, and the Race to Zero movement's got thousands and thousands of businesses with science-based net zero targets. And that's really now turning into the implementation phase with things like the Inflation Reduction Act in the States and the Green Deal in Europe, and also look at what's happening in India and China. Don't just look at the coal they're burning there, which is problematic, but just how fast they're industrializing the clean sectors. So we're making progress. Just this week, the IEA have published updates saying that we're actually ahead of the necessary momentum in deploying solar to get to net zero by 2050 and on track for batteries and EVs. And they're always pretty conservative on their forecast. So this phenomenon of S curves is kicking in, you know, where the growth rate of adoption is exponential. So we're at a point where we've either passed a tipping point in renewables and EVs, or approaching it in some of the other key sectors that are less mature, like green hydrogen, etc. But the great thing is, once those tipping points are crossed, we're in a competitive race. And you can see that in the kind of dialogue between in Europe around the response to the Inflation Reduction Act. It's not a green conversation really, but an industrial strategy and competitiveness conversation. So this is great news, and that's about 75% of the climate problem. But we know that there's no net zero without action on the loss of nature because of the interconnected nature, and we're behind the game. So we've really got to catch up and deploy some of the same tools, but adopted for the very different context of the nature crisis. We know that nature is vital to the planet, to feeding and protecting our communities, to resourcing the global economy, absorbing over half of the world's carbon emissions. So it's actually impossible to overstate its importance. It is literally existential. And the great news is that we've now had if you like, the Paris moment. We had the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, with all the countries in the world coming together to sending a very clear target framework and a real sense of urgency. And we do have some great proactive, forward-thinking businesses who have been working for some time to understand their reliance on and their impact on not just emissions, but nature and ecosystems, and taking the action that assessment leads them to conclude is necessary. But if we're honest, I speak as someone who launched the water disclosure and the forest disclosure work within CDP more than 10 years ago. Still, the majority of corporates are only at the beginning of their journey. So we have huge risks collectively, which of course means that there are huge risks individually for every business and supply chain, but huge opportunities for those who provide the solutions. And now we have this clear global ambition to focus on solutions to the nature crisis as well as the climate crisis, and again, to drive exponential adoption of solutions. And those solutions will not be adopted without the private sector. So it's not an optional extra. It will soon become a competitiveness conversation, not a green conversation or a moral conversation. So it's really exciting for me, having seen the work that Erin and team and partners have done from the very beginning, to see the launch today of the first science-based targets for nature, in a scientifically rigorous way that's relevant to businesses and the different dynamics of ecosystems, from the kind of 1 ton of carbon is 1 ton of carbon everywhere in the world dynamic of climate, to launch these methodologies to help companies measure and therefore understand where the impact is and how to reduce their impact on the environment. Beginning initially with the freshwater and land methodologies. I know we'll hear from the team on the details of those later. But the great thing is this is all doable, and we need this corporate leadership and dynamism and measuring and action to also then influence policy through this ambition loop, so that we end up with the systemic shift that is needed. We're getting clearer and clearer scientific messages of the very dangerous negative impacts of our abuse of nature, and this has to be, these next years, the fulcrum, the turning point where global momentum to tackle nature grows from words to targets to actions in investment and policy alike. And much like climate, I'm absolutely convinced that setting science-based targets will soon become a table stake expectation for business. It's part of how society is internalizing the externalities of the negative impact on future generations from our abuse of ecosystems. So this is the moment. This is a great moment to come together, the corporate community with many partners and great expertise, to shape a positive future for our planet, not just emissions reduction, but nature restoration, nature recovery. Get ahead of the curve, because this is a competitiveness issue, whether you feel it is right now or not, it soon will be, and develop an integrated approach to climate, nature, and science-based target setting. So, as Nick Stern says, taking action to achieve a net zero and nature positive world together is the development story of the 21st century. It's the greatest business opportunity of our lifetime, and one of the most exciting things that any of us could be blessed to work on. So thank you again to Erin, the team, and all the partners, and look forward to hearing more from the detail of these new methodologies. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel, for setting the stage for us. As Nigel just referenced, the Science Based Targets Initiative, SBTI, which you are likely familiar with, is the initiative for companies wanting to set science-based targets for nature. They are part of and the source of inspiration for the Science-Based Targets Network, as we refer to in shorthand, SBTN. We're building on SBTI's momentum of over 3,000 companies that have committed to setting climate science-based targets and net zero commitments. At SBTI, we're extending that approach beyond climate to nature and beyond companies to cities as well. Our focus today is on corporate guidance. We focus on SBTs for nature because SBTI already has climate for companies well covered. And if you're not already engaged with them, we encourage you to do so. And in fact, you'll hear today about ways in which climate is integrated into our approach. We build off that work of SBTI on climate to create a holistic methodology for target setting, reflecting the fact that climate is deeply connected to all aspects of nature. In so doing, we exist to provide companies the guidance, methods, and tools for companies to start answering the following question. What can a company do today to ensure it's doing its part for an equitable, net zero, nature positive future? Now, when I reference we, it's important to note that the same 4 organizations behind SBTI are some of the founding partners of SBTN. We draw upon technical experts, including some of the world's leading scientists and ecosystem experts, working alongside natural and social scientists and sustainability experts. And I personally and our initiative are deeply indebted to the often in-kind support of these individuals and organizations. Together, we have built a coalition of over 80 environmental NGOs and mission-driven organizations to do this work. As part of the broader Global Commons Alliance, our collective mission is to mobilize citizens, cities, companies, and countries to become better guardians of the global commons. Today, we are equipping companies to do their part. SBTN is backed by NGOs to ensure credibility and a firm scientific foundation, and is strengthened by the engagement of over 115 companies that span over 20 sectors and represent $4 trillion in market cap. Together, our global initiative spans 30 countries to date. These organizations and more comprise the over 200 organizations that have helped shape the content we're releasing today to help us achieve a balance between scientific rigor and feasibility. SBTN is organized by hubs that cover 5 key action areas: freshwater, land, ocean, biodiversity, alongside climate with SBTI. Our purpose is to enable companies to take the right actions in the right places at the right time to do their part to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030. We often get the question, where are people in SBTN's approach? People are at the heart of what we do. We recognize that a critical part of setting science-based targets is ensuring that they are both effective and equitable. In recognition of this, we've taken the first steps to embed a recognition of human rights and environmental justice in our methods. We have several tangible examples today. First, aligning with the Earth Commission on its upcoming science on safe and just boundaries. Second, ensuring we have an environmental and social materiality approach to our work. And third, incorporating both social safeguards in the methods themselves, as well as a draft of stakeholder engagement guidance, which Varsha will cover in more detail later. And we anticipate further work to come in this area. We also often get the question, how does SBTN relate to other initiatives? In addition to the guidance, drawing on the best available science today and including that collaboration with the Earth Commission that I mentioned, it's also aligned with global goals on climate, nature, and development, including notably the Global Biodiversity Framework that was just finalized late last year. Science-based targets for nature are also proactively aligned with existing and upcoming sustainability initiatives and frameworks, including the Risk Management and Disclosure Beta Framework from TNFD, Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. This means the methodologies are designed to build on what companies are already doing, with the goal of providing an efficient, effective, and ambitious resource for companies. The corporate measurement, target setting, and reporting architecture for nature is coming together in a similar way to climate. TNFD is aligned with and complementary to TCFD, and SBTN similarly is aligned with and complementary to SBTI, which makes complete sense as nature and climate must be addressed hand in hand. And we're working closely with TNFD to ensure our target setting methods are integrated into the TNFD framework. So before we get into the main part of today's content of the first release, a quick refresher on the foundation of SBTN's approach. First, science-based targets are measurable, actionable, and time-bound objectives informed by the best available science. As one example, you'll see in the content issued today a direct mapping between how the land targets contribute to the specific goals and targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework. At the core of our tools, methods, and guidance for setting targets is a 5-step process that takes companies all the way from assessing their impacts with regards to specific pressures, identifying what parts of their operations and which locations to focus on, to setting targets, all the way to measuring, reporting, and verifying progress against those targets. There are 2 unique aspects to this approach. First, the targets are spatially explicit, reflecting the needs of nature in the locations that companies' pressures occur in. And secondly, that actions must be guided by SBTN's avoid, reduce, restore, regenerate, and transform framework as a hierarchy of action consistent with the conservation or mitigation hierarchy of action. Today's release covers the means for companies to comprehensively assess, interpret, and prioritize their impacts on the environment across the dimensions of freshwater, land, biodiversity, and climate. For target setting, step 3 of our methods, our first coverage is freshwater and land to complement those that already exist for climate via SBTI. This coverage addresses some of the key drivers of biodiversity loss and incentivizes the protection and restoration of ecosystems. In today's session, we'll cover this content in more detail shortly. There are 2 items of note with today's release. First, a note on versioning. Next slide, please. Not all the content is at the same level of readiness. The guidance on steps 1 and 2, and for step 3 freshwater, are version 1. The land methods are at an earlier stage of development, as you'll hear more about, and are in beta form to be tested by the initial target validation group who will be piloting them this year. Second, I want to note that there's additional content to come later this year. We recognize that the release today is technical. It is meant for the implementers, the technical experts that are going to use these methods with companies and in companies. We will accompany that with a corporate manual that's in more generally accessible language later this year, as well as doing a refresh of our TNFD alignment paper and some work on data readiness. These first SBTs for nature are a key milestone in our progress toward comprehensive targets, building on the foundation we set back in 2020 with our initial corporate guidance. They are a meaningful step on the path toward having more comprehensive targets. You'll hear as we walk through the specifics what they are and are not covering. With that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Varsha Vijay, SBTN's Technical Director, to cover the technical content in the first release. Varsha.
Thank you, Erin. It's a pleasure to walk you through the technical content for our first release of science-based targets for nature today. In developing our work, as Erin has already stated, we really aimed for this critical balance of scientific rigor and actionability across our methods. Each of the speakers will walk you through that process for different portions of the methods, and I'm going to start where our methods begin, with our step 1 and 2 methods. Of course, this work is only possible thanks to generous support from our funders. It's also impossible to talk about this work without emphasizing what a group effort it's been. Of course, we've already spoken about this broad partner network, but specific to these methodologies, this work has been led by the SBTN Network Hub technical team with support from a working group composed of NGOs and mission-driven organizations with feedback and input from many others, including academic experts, and also advice on the feasibility of our methods from our corporate engagement program. So looking at our methodologies, you almost could think of this work as a funnel, taking you from that first portion of our methodology that covers the broadest coverage in terms of pressures on the environment and business components for target setting, and then narrowing down to the places that are really critical for action. An integral part of the first release of science-based targets for nature is the step 1 and 2 methods. All companies start their SBTN journey by assessing their pressures with step 1 and prioritizing the locations and business components for target setting using science-based targets for nature in step 2. This provides a greater ability to take urgent action in line with global goals for nature and society. This guidance maximizes synergies, minimizes trade-offs for nature, biodiversity, and broader corporate sustainability efforts. Of course, this includes many of these areas that we've already talked about as critical areas to address nature impacts. That includes freshwater and land, as well as some coverage of oceans and biodiversity, and an initial assessment of climate impacts that guides companies towards the guidance in SBTI's framework. So I'm next going to walk you through some of the specifics of our step 1 method. Companies first screen their impacts on nature based on their contributions towards the key pressures driving nature loss and biodiversity loss in what we're calling the materiality screening. This materiality screening is aligned with the IPBES framework. It also builds on existing approaches already used by companies, but increases that ambition to ensure a consistent and comprehensive assessment approach across value chain and, very critically, across environmental pressures. They then conduct a first quantification or assessment of company-specific environmental impacts by estimating their pressures. This is crucially a spatially explicit analysis, so it needs to incorporate data describing the state of nature, including biodiversity, in the locations, the places in which companies' impacts are occurring. Having collected data on pressures and the states of nature in the places they operate, the company must define locations and activities that they should set science-based targets for on a given pressure category, and we'll go into the work of the step 3 methods and its specificity. The set of locations per pressure or per target setting method is called a target boundary. But in recognition that the company will need to prioritize actions, we introduce a structured process to ensure that they are acting first by setting and validating targets in the locations where nature and biodiversity need it most. So the locations in which the company must act first to set targets should reduce negative impacts and in line with the mitigation hierarchy, again, focusing on avoiding and reducing negative impacts before increasing positive impacts on the environment. This is also where companies can introduce important information regarding local stakeholder needs, as well as company feasibility and financial materiality. So to summarize, these steps are an essential precursor to the step 3 target setting methods for setting and validating science-based targets. We're also pleased to release with this first release of 2 open access tools to facilitate the completion of the step 1 and 2 methods. We anticipate additional updates to these tools, which cover first the materiality screening process through an open access tool that everyone can use to understand environmental issues associated with company activities. And second, a high impact commodity list, which focuses company actions on known environmental impacts of commodities. We do anticipate additional updates to these tools as a result of pilot testing and learning, but as they stand, they inform an important part of our work towards ensuring that these methods are truly actionable for a broad group of companies. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Alan Townsend, co-lead of the SBTN Freshwater Hub, to walk you through in greater detail the Step 3 freshwater target setting methods.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alan Townsend, and I'm a Senior Program Officer on WWF's Freshwater and Food team. I also have the privilege of serving as the co-lead for the Freshwater Hub. And today I'm excited to give a brief overview of the Freshwater Step 3 guidance. SBTN's Freshwater Hub is a collaborative effort to develop the technical guidance. The hub is led by CDP and WWF, along with Pacific Institute, World Resources Institute, and the Nature Conservancy. To get the freshwater guidance to this point, it's gone through several reviews, iterations, and pilots. General Mills, Procter & Gamble, and Centauri piloted the methods in various parts of their value chain in 2022. They also received technical support from the organizations shown on this slide. The Freshwater Hub has also made efforts to align with complementary frameworks, such as Alliance for Water Stewardship and CDP's disclosure system. Just want to have a sincere thank you to our key funders and to those who contributed core support from which we benefit. So now I'm going to talk about the aspects that are covered in this version of the freshwater methods. First is the surface water flows and groundwater levels. And for groundwater, specifically where local models and thresholds exist. For water quality, the scope includes phosphorus and nitrogen. And then for the value chain, that it includes upstream value chain and direct operations. For these, we decided these were the critical areas to start in terms of aspects based on impacts and other factors, such as global data coverage. In the next iteration, we plan to broaden the scope for groundwater and include toxic chemicals among other considerations. So these targets are, next slide, please. Thank you. These targets are based on the assessment of freshwater use and pollution that companies do in steps 1 and 2 of the guidance, and the prioritization that helps companies act most urgently in the places where nature needs it most. They then use step 3 methods to set and validate targets that will allow for quantifiable contributions to reducing company pressures via the freshwater quality and quantity targets. Note that these are basin specific and, where possible, use local models and bottom-up knowledge to enable the best fit for local environment and social conditions. And as a result of step 3, companies will set targets. Here is thank you. Here are example targets that companies set on an annual or monthly basis. And now I'll hand it over to Craig Beatty to discuss land.
Great, thanks, Alan. My name is Craig Beatty, and I co-lead the SBTN Land Hub on behalf of World Wildlife Fund. And today I really have the honor to represent the entire Land Hub in launching our technical guidance. So this guidance will, we can go back, this guidance will ultimately allow companies to set targets for land as a critical contribution to their targets for nature. And in these targets, we focus on land and its relationship to companies through how it is directly used, and the many ways that companies can indirectly impact or support land and the diversity of life that it supports. Before I get into the target details, it's important for you that I outline the context of these targets and what you can expect from SBTN land targets from today forward. Next. So like Alan highlighted for the Freshwater Hub, the Land Hub has the responsibility for the technical development of these targets. Our steering committee is composed of World Wildlife Fund, Conservation International, World Resources Institute, the Nature Conservancy, and the Food and Land Use Coalition with support from Systemic. These methods also represent our collaboration with many other institutions, individuals, and initiatives to augment our deep technical expertise in the development of our new land targets. So starting 1 year ago, we fast-tracked the development of this suite of targets to arrive at the launch today. However, the targets you see have not yet been tested in company contexts, and we're thrilled that over the next 6 months, we have the opportunity to pilot these targets with the companies represented in SBTN's initial target validation group. This will really allow us to understand how the targets work in many different company situations, how the targets work together, and to test those components of the targets that represent the current boundaries of feasibility, knowledge, and ambition in target setting. So following this pilot process, we'll publish a version 1 of the land targets early in 2024. This is the version that'll be available for all companies that have material impacts on land to set land targets. This launch represents an important milestone for the development of the next version of land targets, which will provide companies with stronger science around what nature needs in different places. So the Land Hub has worked in parallel to the development of the targets that we launched today to understand the science that will underpin the approach we take in version 2. And we've designed our current targets in such a way that we are entirely confident that the progress against the targets today will contribute to the next iteration of our land targets. And with that, I'll explain our 3 land targets. Next. So these targets are designed to cover SBTN's mitigation hierarchy, which Aaron outlined before. And so each are highlighted here with examples of the target language below that might apply to companies, although this is going to differ slightly depending on a specific company's context. So our first target is no conversion of natural ecosystems. And this is a target that directs companies to remove all deforestation and conversion of natural ecosystems from their operations and supply chains for hard and soft commodities that drive the conversion of natural ecosystems at global or regional scales. The cutoff for this target is 2020, and the required target dates vary based on the position of the company in the value chain and the geography of direct operations and sourcing. A key feature of this target is the development of SBTN's natural lands map, which companies should use only in the context of this target to understand what land is natural and what land is not natural in 2020, and to set their no conversion target. Here, companies will commit to zero conversion of natural ecosystems and the remediation of all conversion that occurred between 2020 and the year that they set this target. Our second target highlights the role of large agricultural systems and their pressures on land. Science continues to point to the expansion and impact of agricultural land as a key threat to nature. In line with this science, the land footprint reduction target asks large agricultural companies to commit to reducing the area of productive agricultural land in line with the global reductions that are required, or to reduce the intensity of the production. Our third target on landscape engagement is the most novel of the 3, and the one that addresses the regenerative, the restorative, and the transformative potential of these land targets. While the other 2 targets have more nuanced conditions around how the target applies to a company, the landscape engagement target will likely apply to all companies setting science-based targets for land. This target asks companies to commit to engaging in materially relevant landscape initiatives. In addition to supporting companies in the implementation of the first 2 targets, it also places company actions on land targets within a landscape context and asks that they meaningfully engage in multi-stakeholder landscape scale initiatives to improve ecological and social conditions. Of course, our guidance document outlines the details and science around each of these targets, which will be further tested and understood during the pilot period over the next 6 months. In these pilots, we have many learning objectives, a few of which I'd like to highlight right now. So we'll have that incredible opportunity to understand these targets with the initial target validation group. And within this process, the Land Hub does have a lot of objectives for how we think about these targets and a lot of the details. But if there are a few general ones that rise to the top. So first, our public consultation demonstrated that there was a wide range of views, both affirming and questioning the ambition of our targets and their feasibility. We will use the pilot process to test this across all 3 of the land targets and how they work together. Second, anytime we talk about land, we have to recognize that it's something that's very personal. And this happens all the time when people talk about for example, the area that is available for restoration. And the brevity of a statement like that might lose the fact that land is not just freely available to achieve these targets. Land is connected to people, and it informs our identities. How this is considered in the context of setting targets regarding social safeguards and stakeholder engagement is key. Finally, and especially for the target on landscape engagement, how the science that we've relied on for these targets plays out as companies work to set these targets will be something that we're keen to understand. Much of the data and tools are new and developing, and the methods include both required and suggested metrics and data that will take time to better understand during the pilot process. A key component of this is on the requirement for substantial improvement in landscapes, and especially the threats to biodiversity that land targets are not able to address alone, which Varsha is going to outline next. You can find all the details of the land targets in the land guidance, which we've published today, along with a document outlining information that's supplementary to the guidance, as well as the technical documentation for our SBTN natural lands map. Thank you for the opportunity today, and over to you, Varsha.
Thank you, Craig. So I'm really happy to build on what Craig has now talked about regarding the work that the Land Hub, the Freshwater Hub, and others are doing to think about biodiversity, to answer the kind of broader question that we get asked so often, next slide please, about how SBTN's work contributes to mitigating biodiversity loss. So let me just say here, if there's any lack of clarity on it, that a core aim of our work is to contribute to the conservation and restoration of natural ecosystems and the mitigation of biodiversity loss. With that core tenet, in the first release of our methods, biodiversity is incorporated to some extent inside the methodologies, and I'm going to walk through that briefly. So first, biodiversity is incorporated into steps 1 and 2 in the environmental impact assessment, including the prioritization of sites for target setting, which are of critical importance for biodiversity and for the mitigation of biodiversity loss. That knowledge then guides the application of the science-based target setting methods in step 3. Specifically to the freshwater targets, they will positively impact freshwater species and ecosystem through aligning with thresholds that incorporate the needs of certain freshwater species and ecosystems in the freshwater quantity and the quality target. Here you see a depiction of the association between a target like the one on freshwater pollution in kind of preventing and stopping eutrophication. As Craig just talked about, the land targets also think about biodiversity in very critical ways, in the sense that they really comprehensively address land use change and also take on some critical aspects of land use that are contributing to actually one of the primary drivers of biodiversity loss, and really contribute to that reduction of pressures in those specific areas. However, as Craig already alluded to, we know that this is a learning and growth process for us, and there's more that we can do to cover biodiversity within our methods. To describe what it is that we currently do inside this first release of methods and where we will grow in the future, we've released a first initial short paper from the Biodiversity Hub that describes an initial analysis of this and a projection of where key gaps are in the methods. One example of that are the critical pressures of overexploitation of species and invasive species, which our methods are not able to currently address. So we'll be thinking about that in the future and building out our knowledge, both with additional research efforts as well as method developments that involve the Biodiversity Hub, as well as collaboration across the realm-based methodologies. Next, please. So as Aaron said, another really critical question we get asked is where the people are in our methods. So of course, this is also very core to our mission and to the work that we're doing. Aaron already went over the principles that we align with, but I'm going to talk briefly about our first draft of stakeholder engagement guidance, which is part of this first release of methodologies. So we are really looking to ensure that as companies are applying the target setting methods, they're doing their best to ensure that they are setting effective and equitable targets. That is impossible without a complementary process of stakeholder engagement. We see this process as existing in parallel to all the other methodologies and critically incorporated inside the validation requirements for application of the methods. The specific guidance really focuses on those who have the greatest potential of harm associated with companies' business activities, as well as potentially the application of science-based target setting methods. And you'll see specific notes associated with the rights of Indigenous peoples and others who are deeply connected to nature in the places that companies are working and setting science-based targets. We recognize that this is a critical first step, and we anticipate further developments and safeguards introduced in our methods, both with this pilot testing process, as well as new method developments associated with our step 4 and step 5 methodologies to come. With that, I will hand back over to Erin to zoom us out.
Thank you, Varsha. So last part of our presentation is why are companies acting and how can they take action? So first, the first companies are taking action on nature because they see the risks of inaction and the opportunities for leadership. Understanding and addressing their environmental impacts can help companies tackle issues including supply chain disruptions, reputational damage, and costs from regulatory noncompliance, and can also increase business value such as access to capital and competitive advantage, as demonstrated by the business benefits those that have set climate science-based targets have seen. Looking ahead, we have 17 companies using this first release to set and have validated the first science-based targets beyond climate. They were part of an applicant pool of 55 companies who volunteered to be part of this process and were selected based on 3 criteria. First, readiness, the degree to which the company has appropriate data, technical capacity, experience with SBTN methods and SBTI methods, and C-suite and internal support. Second, representativeness in terms of sector, geography of target setting, value chain position, and service provider partners such as NGOs and consultancies. And third, most importantly, their impact on nature. All of these sectors highly impact nature. The purpose of this pilot is to ensure that the process for companies to set targets is robust, feasible, and clear, and so that we have the ability to make any necessary optimizations before full rollout, which we're anticipating in early 2024. We also want to gain an understanding of the anticipated process times for companies and required resources to scale and respond to the demand that we receive. The pilot's also going to inform our investigation of alternative validation models that best fit both the complexity of the methods, plans to scale, and the evolution of the methods. We plan to distill the lessons learned from this pilot into an anonymized public report, and then plan for rollout beyond these 17 companies, as I mentioned, in early 2024. So you may be asking, what about the companies that aren't part of this pilot group? What can they do today? And I think this is incredibly critical because we have no intention or desire to be holding back company action because action is urgent, and we're calling on all businesses to take action now. With this initial release of science-based targets for nature, companies can start the target setting process to assess and prioritize their environmental impacts and prepare to set freshwater and land targets ahead of that rollout early next year. For those that aren't ready, start getting ready. We have resources to support you. Check out our website. So with that, we've reached the close of the presentation portion of this session, and we'll now move to Q&A. If you have a question that you haven't already submitted, please do so. And we'll start with the first question that I see that we frequently hear, which is this separate to SBTI and climate? How does SBTN's work build on the climate work? And to help answer this question, I'd like to introduce Martha Stevenson, who is both a member of SBTN's Product Development Council, a senior advisor to our Land Hub, and involved in SBTI alongside her other responsibilities at WWF. Many hats to wear. Martha.
Great, thanks, Erin. And again, congrats to the team on the launch today. Very excited for you all. And thanks everyone for joining this launch webinar. So yes, we've seen lots of questions come in through the Q&A about the relationship between SBTI and SBTN. They are separate organizations, but as Erin has explained, there's lots of overlap in terms of the partnerships and also the work that we do, lots of coordination between our organizations. We're really focused on nature here, but as many folks know, nature and climate are so related, as Nigel outlined very clearly for us in his opening remarks. So I'll answer this from a very practical perspective, from a corporate perspective, how work that companies have done in their SBTI targets on climate, how does that relate to this new set of guidance that we are launching today? So, and I'll answer it kind of in two ways. So first, looking at your inventory data, your target setting process, and then also on implementation. So from the target setting and inventory data side, so for companies, if you've done your greenhouse gas inventory using greenhouse gas protocol or some other methodology, you already have a lot of the activity data on your operations and supply chain data that you would need to work through the steps 1 and 2 of the SBTN process that Varsha outlined. And so once you have that activity data for your greenhouse gas emissions, adding water and land impacts on top of that is a much lighter lift. You already have a lot of the work done. Particularly if you're using life cycle assessment data, a lot of that water and land data would already be present there. If you're taking more of an emissions factor approach, you might have to go back and again, make sure that you're getting some of that data into your supply chain calculations. But generally speaking, you've done a lot of the work that will make it a much lighter lift. Specifically with the land targets, I've answered this in the chat, but just to come back to it, we did a lot of work to align the land targets with the greenhouse gas protocol and flag, the SBTI flag target, to make sure companies can build on that momentum as they are looking at nature. But this is where it brings us to the implementation side, and this is almost more important. So while we divide up climate and nature from a target setting perspective, when we get to the field, the convergence is in the doing, right? In the activity we're doing in the field. And there are so many actions that companies can take that deliver both climate and nature outcomes. Stopping conversion of habitat as soon as possible. That's an obvious one. It addresses 11% of global emissions and also is a principal driver of biodiversity loss. But there are also improved management practices like conservation tillage or extending rotation lengths that also have these dual benefits. And one of the reasons I'm so excited about the nature platform is because when we lead our interventions with nature, not from a climate perspective, but when we really start looking at it from a holistic nature perspective, and that can be expressed in the difference between carbon farming with trees versus forest landscape restoration, which many of you know and are experts on, is a much different approach. The outcomes when we lead with nature are better for people, they're better for nature, they're better for climate, and they're more permanent. And so this is why we think this work is so important and contributory to the broader dialogue. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Martha. Next up, we have a question that is, how does SBTN anticipate the methods changing as a result of the pilot? And here I'd like to invite Craig to come in specifically on the land portion and Varsha more broadly.
Great. Thanks, Erin. So over the next 6 months, one of the main things that we'd like to look at, and this is especially for the landscape engagement target, when you read through that target, there are lots of components of that target that are really quite novel for corporate target setting. And so the targets themselves between now and version 1 in early 2024 will remain the same. We will have a target on no conversion of natural ecosystems. We will have a target on land footprint reduction, and we will have a target on landscape engagement. What will change between the version that you see today and the version that we finalize will be, especially in the landscape engagement target, a better understanding of the science and the metrics that apply to setting those targets. there probably will also be additional changes that we'll look at in terms of the specifics of each of those targets, but we're really looking forward to exploring kind of the novel way that companies engage in landscapes, the types of landscapes initiatives that are available for companies to engage in, and then the process for doing that. And so there might be some changes in the version from today and the version that is version 1 regarding the metrics and science that we use to understand the substantial improvement component of the landscape engagement target in particular. Varsha.
Thanks, Craig. To complement Craig's answer on the land methods, I'd like to refer back to my background in quantitative modeling. This is a critical stress test of our work. We've done a lot of amazing work. We've had the opportunity for feedback and iteration to represent the best possible science that we know of. However, in trying to achieve that balance between scientific rigor and feasibility, we really need real testing data to understand how it works in practice. This pilot for validation will allow us to really get a window into how companies are using our methods, where there might be critical gaps in our validation criteria. And I would say this pilot can be thought of as a place to iron out those pieces rather than a big leap in our development, which is more easily captured through our versioning that Craig already referred to. One example of an area in which we could see changes associated with this testing is the work that we've done to try to understand feasibility in terms of upstream data availability. This is a critical challenge that companies face, but we want to ensure the ambition of our methodologies. So I've gone out with some very ambitious requirements, and we'll be looking to understand how we can keep the methods actionable while addressing some of the needs that we have to ensure the most comprehensive coverage of environmental impacts throughout a company's value chain. That's just one example. Thanks.
Great, thank you both. While I have you on the line, I've got another question that's come in. What is meant by biodiversity targets as a separate category of targets to freshwater and land? Varsha, you want to tackle that? And Craig, if you have anything to add, chime in.
Sure, and I'm going to bound this by what we know now. So first, I'd like folks who asked that question to refer to our biodiversity short paper, which we're releasing alongside the launch, which explains some of our thinking on this. But we talk about kind of two different ways to very critically mitigate biodiversity loss. Craig did a great job in talking about the land targets and their connections to the global biodiversity framework and to major drivers of biodiversity loss. The Freshwater Hub has already touched on that, and I touched on that in the context of step 1 and 2 methods. But in the recognition that there's more that we can do, we could take the lens of pressures, which we could think of through our realm-based methodologies and how they show up in those realms. Or we could take the approach of identifying indicators within target setting methodologies that are specifically aimed at addressing different dimensions of biodiversity to ensure that comprehensive coverage of biodiversity. We're actually exploring both of those possibilities in the context of our upcoming detailed research analysis and future developments in the Biodiversity Hub, and with critical collaboration across the other hubs to ensure where best these approaches fit. Greg, do you want to complement that?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that we've been very purposeful in developing these targets is addressing those pressures to biodiversity that we're able to address through land targets. And so you see that in our targets. The no conversion of natural ecosystems target clearly has impacts on natural ecosystems. A reduction in pressures from large agricultural systems, and then substantial improvements to ecology and landscape scale conditions all have benefits on and a focus on biodiversity. But among those pressures to biodiversity, land cannot address all of them. And there are components that land targets or freshwater targets cannot address. So to the extent that we've been able to internalize the ways that companies interact with land and the impacts of that interaction as it relates to biodiversity, we've been able to internalize that in the targets today, and we'll continue to work on internalizing those in the future. There are, and referring to the short paper on biodiversity, to understand where freshwater and land targets might not capture some of the pressures that are driving biodiversity and nature loss around the world. So I look forward to that as well, and to further strengthening biodiversity in SBTN's methods.
Great, thank you both. Alan, I also wondered if you wanted to come in here to recap how biodiversity is and is not covered in the first version of the freshwater methods.
Hi, Erin. Yeah, so I tried to address this in the Q&A, but yeah, so freshwater biodiversity is covered in part through the target setting process, through mechanisms such as environmental consideration for environmental flows, and looking at water pollution from a nutrient pollution from a threshold perspective that is protective of ecosystems. In future versions, we plan to more explicitly include freshwater biodiversity in step 3.
Great, thank you, Alan. And I just wanted to note that we've got more than 160 questions in the Q&A function that we have not been able to answer. And those questions will be captured, and we will be using it to review and update our FAQs for follow-up after this meeting. So I think we have time for one last question, and we've got one on what financial institutions can do with this first release. So financial institutions play a vital role in driving and facilitating system change, and there is momentum. Just as of this week, there's 15 new signatories to the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge. And while today's release focuses on companies, that's a necessary precursor to guidance for financial institutions, as it was with SBTI. We plan to work with partners on more specific guidance for the financial sector. The timing of that is to be determined, but we will announce when we know it. And in the meantime, today, financial institutions can encourage and support clients and investees to set science-based targets for nature. They can also assess and disclose the impacts and dependencies of their portfolios, and we encourage them to do both of those things. So with that, I would like to thank our network. None of this would be possible without the power of this network. It's a unique collaboration of over 80 leading global nonprofits and mission-driven organizations, a collective of the world's leading technical experts alongside sustainability experts and business leaders. We wouldn't exist otherwise. And finally, thank you all for joining our webinar. We hope you found it informative and enjoyable. And we will be in touch soon with a follow-up note that will include the recording, the slides, and links to frequently asked questions that we were unable to get to. So thank you all.